In the early 1930s, something began to die beneath the feet of ordinary Americans. Not slowly, not quietly. It collapsed the way empires always do, first invisible, then all at once. The sky over Kansas turned the color of rust. Oklahoma went dark at noon. Texas disappeared behind walls of earth that moved like living things. Farmers who had worked the same land for decades stood on their porches and watched the horizon turn black. Not storm clouds, dust, miles of it, thousands of feet high, rolling toward them at the speed of a freight train. And there was nowhere to go. The animals died first, suffocated where they stood, then the crops, then the wells, and when the wells went dry, the people left. Over 3 million Americans abandoned their homes during what scientists would later call the worst ecological disaster in the recorded history of the United States. But here is what the history books don't tell you. This didn't happen because of bad luck. It didn't happen because of weather alone. It happened because an entire civilization had built its survival on a foundation it never stopped to question. Water, reliable, endless, always there, until it wasn't. And in the space of a single decade, everything those families had built, every acre plowed, every home raised, every life planned, turned to dust. This is the story of how a nation lost its water, and what that collapse looked like from the inside. Before the storms came, the Great Plains felt like a promise. Endless flat land stretching to every horizon. Soil so dark and rich it looked almost black in the morning light. Farms producing wheat by the millions of bushels. Families building lives from the ground up with nothing but hard work and the belief that the land would always give back what you put into it. And for a time, it did. But underneath that prosperity, something was already broken. For decades, settlers had been doing something that seemed logical at the time. They were removing the native grasses that had covered the plains for thousands of years and replacing them with crops. Wheat, cotton, sorghum, row after row, mile after mile. And every year the harvests came. Prices rose, more land was cleared, more grass was torn out, more soil was exposed. Nobody asked what those grasses were actually doing there. Nobody thought to question it. Because when things are working, people rarely stop to examine the system beneath them. But those grasses were not just decoration. They were infrastructure. Their roots went down 3, 4, sometimes 6 feet into the earth. They held moisture in the soil during dry months. They created a biological net that kept the land anchored, alive, and breathing even when the rains were sparse. When the grasses were gone, the soil had nothing to hold on to. And here is where the story shifts from economics into something darker. The rain had always been inconsistent on the Great Plains. That was not new. Dry years had come before, and the land had recovered, because the grasses were still there to protect it. But by the late 1920s, those grasses were largely gone across millions of acres. So when the drought arrived in 1930, there was no buffer, no protection, no biological memory in the soil of how to survive without rain. The earth simply gave up. It dried from the surface downward, cracked into plates, turned to powder. And then the wind found it. The winds on the Great Plains are not gentle. They move in long, sustained patterns that can strip exposed soil the way water strips paint. And in 1931, they began to do exactly that. The first dust storms were small enough that people dismissed them. A nuisance, a bad season. It would pass. It did not pass. By 1932, the storms were being counted by the dozens. By 1933, by the hundreds. Walls of displaced earth moving across state lines, blocking out the sun for hours at a time, forcing families indoors with wet rags pressed against door frames just to keep the air breathable. And beneath all of it, beneath the darkness and the suffocation and the ruin, was one single truth that nobody wanted to say out loud. The water was gone. Not the rain, not yet entirely, but the water stored in the soil, the water held by roots, the water that had once made this land capable of sustaining life through dry spells. That water had been disappearing for years, quietly, invisibly, long before the first dust cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. This is the part of the Dust Bowl that history tends to skip over, because it is uncomfortable. It forces a question that most people would rather not sit with. What happens to a civilization when the system it depends on for water stops working? Not theoretically, not as a distant possibility, but tomorrow morning when someone turns on the tap and nothing comes out. The Great Plains had no answer for that question in 1931, and 30 million people paid the price. Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935. That is the date historians use to mark the single worst day of the entire Dust Bowl era. But for the people who lived through it, it wasn't a date on a calendar. It was the day they thought the world was ending. The morning had started clear, unusually warm, almost pleasant. Families had stepped outside after weeks of storms, grateful for a moment of calm. Children played in yards, farmers walked their fields, women hung laundry on lines stretched between fence posts. And then someone looked north. On the horizon, moving at nearly 60 miles per hour, was a wall of earth so massive, so tall, that it blocked everything behind it. Witnesses described it as a mountain range that wasn't there an hour ago, a moving cliff of darkness stretching from the ground to the upper atmosphere. It was 200 miles wide, it was over a mile high, and it was moving directly toward them. People had less than minutes to react. Those who were caught outside described the same sensation. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air went completely still, and then the light disappeared. Not dimmed, not faded, gone. Total darkness at 3 in the afternoon. Families who had been separated by even short distances could not find each other. People drove their cars into ditches because they could not see the road directly in front of them. A man in Oklahoma described crawling on his hands and knees with one hand touching the fence line just to find his own front door. Inside the homes, the dust was not stopped by walls. It came through keyholes, through window frames, through the gaps around door hinges. It settled on kitchen tables, on beds, on the faces of sleeping children. Mothers pressed wet cloth against the mouths of their infants. Some of the children developed what doctors began calling dust pneumonia. Their lungs filled slowly, silently with particles of displaced earth. It looked like tuberculosis on the X-rays, but it wasn't tuberculosis. It was the land itself, entering their bodies. And through all of it, through the darkness and the suffocation and the terror of that single afternoon, the question that kept returning was not about the storms. It was about water. Because by 1935, the connection had become undeniable. Every major dust storm that tore through the plains was a direct consequence of soil that had lost its moisture. Every farm abandoned, every family displaced, every well that produced nothing but a dry cough when the handle was pulled, it all traced back to the same origin point. Water had been taken for granted, and now it was extracting its price. The human cost by mid-decade was staggering. Hospitals overwhelmed, livestock populations decimated, crop failure stretching across multiple consecutive seasons with no recovery in sight. And the migration had begun in earnest. Not a slow drift, a mass exodus. Families loading everything they owned onto flatbed trucks and driving west toward California, toward Oregon, toward anywhere that might still have what the plains no longer could offer. Something reliable, something that flowed when you needed it, something as simple and as irreplaceable as water. There is something deeply unsettling about studying the Dust Bowl from a distance. Not because of the scale of the destruction, not because of the images of black storms swallowing entire towns, not because of the numbers, the millions displaced, the billions of tons of topsoil lost, the decade of suffering compressed into textbook paragraphs. What is unsettling is something quieter than all of that. It is the realization that nobody saw it coming. Not because the signs weren't there, they were. The soil was thinning. The water table was dropping. The native grasses had been disappearing for decades. But the system was still producing. The harvests were still coming in. The taps were still running. And when a system is still working, the human mind has an almost reflexive resistance to imagining that it could stop. Psychologists call it normalcy bias. The tendency to underestimate the possibility of disaster because nothing disastrous has happened yet. The quiet assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. That the infrastructure holding your life together is more permanent than it actually is. The farmers of the Great Plains were not foolish people. They were not careless or reckless or ignorant. They were human. They trusted the system because the system had never failed them before. And that trust is exactly what made the collapse so complete. Because by the time the warning signs became impossible to ignore, the foundation was already gone. The grasses were already removed. The soil was already exposed. The moisture was already lost. There was no going back. There was only the storm. And this is the lesson that the Dust Bowl carries forward into every generation that is willing to sit with it long enough to feel its full weight. Dependence is invisible until it isn't. You do not feel dependent on water until the moment it disappears. You do not notice the infrastructure beneath your daily life until the morning it fails to function. You do not understand how fragile a system is until you are standing in the middle of its collapse, reaching for something that is no longer there. The families who suffered most during the Dust Bowl were not the ones who lacked resources. They were the ones who lacked alternatives. They had built everything around a single source, a single well, a single system, a single assumption that the water would always come. When it didn't, they had nothing to fall back on.
History does not repeat itself in identical form, but it does repeat its logic. The logic of systems that are trusted without being understood. The logic of resources that are consumed without being protected. The logic of communities that build everything on foundations they never stopped to examine. The Dust Bowl ended. The rains eventually returned. The land slowly, painfully recovered over many years. But the people who waited for the recovery were not the same people who had been there at the beginning. Most of them were already gone. And what they left behind was not just empty land. It was a warning, written in dust. The Dust Bowl ended over 80 years ago, but the conditions that created it never fully disappeared. They shifted, they evolved, they spread into new regions, new water systems, new dependencies that most people living inside them have never stopped to question. Today, the Ogallala Aquifer, the massive underground water reserve that stretches beneath 8 states across the Great Plains, is being depleted at a rate that has no natural recovery timeline. Scientists are not debating whether it will run out. They are debating when. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, has recorded its lowest water levels since the moment it was first filled. Across the American West, rivers that fed entire agricultural systems for generations are running at fractions of their historic capacity. And yet, most households wake up every morning and turn on the tap without a single thought, because the water still comes out. And that is precisely the moment in the story where we should feel the most uncomfortable. Because that is exactly what the farmers of the Great Plains were doing in 1929.
The water was still there, the system was still working, and the collapse was already in motion beneath the surface, invisible, silent, and accelerating. The warning the Dust Bowl carries is not about dust. It was never about dust. It is about what happens to people who place their survival entirely in the hands of a system they do not control and never thought to question. Preparation is not paranoia. It is the oldest form of wisdom recorded in human history. Every civilization that survived prolonged hardship did so because some portion of its people refused to assume that tomorrow would look like today. They built reserves. They created alternatives. They found ways to remain functional when the systems around them failed. That instinct, that quiet, deliberate act of preparation before the crisis arrives, is exactly what separates the families who provided during the Dust Bowl from the families who were forced to flee. If this story stirred something in you, if you found yourself thinking about your own dependence on water systems you have never examined, there is a resource worth exploring. It is linked in the description below this video. It won't ask anything dramatic from you, just your attention, and perhaps the willingness to ask one honest question. If the water stopped tomorrow, what would you do?